All right, sorry, he's very vocal. Um, Play from the start. Okay, can y'all see my screen okay? Okay, so like I said, it's my talk today is it's called Creating an Analysis Plan, and for quantitative questions, qualitative work is super important, but it is not my focus or my expertise, so we're gonna focus on the quantitative questions today. So do want to add the caveat that qualitative work is really informative and helpful. So the first thing is you have to think of a question. So think about what interests you. Research projects generally take at least a year, usually longer than that. So it needs to be something that piques your interest for a long time, for you to want to stay dedicated to it. And I know not everyone on this call is a clinician, but as many of y'all are, I think that your clinical experience can be really the foundation of a good question. And often it starts with me wondering, why is this happening? What is happening? Why are we doing it this way? There seems to be a better way. And obviously, especially as a learner, there's usually a reason things are done that way. But I think as a researcher, you can always use that to your advantage and kind of learn from your patients and learn from your clinical experience and really drive the questions from that experience. And so that's a good place to start. Another good place to start is thinking about, if you're more on the research side, think about your last project. I always find that once I have one conclusion drawn, it usually leads to another question or 10 questions. So I think writing down your questions as you go along is really important too, because oftentimes you'll forget, oh, I had a really great question in the middle of this project, and now I need a new question. So keeping tabs of those, keeping kind of a running list, is helpful to then go back to once you're in a place to start thinking of a brand new question. And then the third way is talking to other people. So I find that other people are usually much smarter than me and have thought of really interesting questions. So think about what others have seen and what they've observed and what questions have piqued their interest. And usually you can find a middle ground. Oh. So after you think of your question, you should generally have a field in which you're thinking about. So it should have 2 to 3 key words. Usually it's like, okay, what population am I thinking and what problem am I thinking? So for us, it's usually, pregnancy or postpartum, and then opioid use disorder. So I usually just go to PubMed and search those things. So last time I did a search, it was Medicaid expansion and postpartum outcomes. And there's surprisingly and very disappointingly very little on that. So that's a great place to start, just a good PubMed search, and it can really help guide, okay, what questions have been asked? And also really important, what language are people using? So a lot of times I'll think of a phrase that I think describes a topic really well, but then I get into PubMed and people are using all kinds of stuff. So the language is really important because that's how you find the research that you want to plug into. So what keywords are other people using? And then think about what data sources are people generally using the same data source and asking different questions? Are they using a bunch of different data sources? For my work with Medicaid expansion, it's usually state specific. So we use Virginia data, but people look at Michigan data or Boston data, or Massachusetts data. So think about what kind of data people are using and how similar it is across different researchers. And then if you like one particular researcher or they seem to be in a field that you're interested in, you can Google them and then kind of follow their work. So you end up on kind of a trail on what people have been doing so far. And then obviously pay attention to what they're finding. Are they finding a relationship between the variable you're interested in and the outcome? Are they finding no relationship? And y'all are probably somewhat aware at least of publication bias. So generally, like, it's very hard to publish null results or when people don't find a relationship. So you can think, okay, if I'm not seeing a lot of information about a subject, maybe it's because there was no relationship people have identified. They might have asked the question before, but not published null results. So that's another thing to be thinking about. But obviously you want to look at what direction is the relationship and the strength of that relationship. And it can be really interesting. Does it hold across different populations? So do people find a specific relationship in, for example, rural populations versus urban populations? So think about also how transferable it is. And then most importantly for you at this point is what gaps are people identifying? And that's usually in the discussion section of the paper. So what are they saying? We would love researchers to look at next. And then you can say, oh, perfect, I want to answer that question. So thinking about within the discussion, authors are generally really good at pointing out what needs to be done next. So that's a good place to start if you're not quite sure. And this is what I use for my literature reviews. I'll send a bunch of resources because I have example analysis plans, like formats that I use, and a couple different ones based on my research experience so far. And then I also have literature reviews I've done, so I'll send that. But I usually do my literature review in Excel or in Google Sheets, depending on if I want to share it with other people. And these are the literal columns I use. And so as you can see here, it's what question did they ask? What population did they do or focus on? What was the outcome variable? What were the variables of interest? Covariates, so what were people controlling for, or what was the moderators, mediators, what method did they use, and then the results, and then gaps, and then I usually have an extra column that's just like things that I think are important. And that can also be that extra column. If someone writes a really good discussion about the history of that subject, I'll put, this was a really good discussion, go back, because sometimes it can be hard to find the history of a subject matter. So that's always a good thing to note too. So that's what I use. I think it's the most helpful way to organize because literature reviews can get a little unwieldy, but that's just one example. And in the beginning, when you're just thinking about the question, you don't have to make it this formal, but this is also what I use when I'm writing a paper. So just the basic. So once you've looked at the literature, formed a question, now you need to write, now you need to identify the gap specifically and then write your objective. So like I said, maybe the gap you want to focus on is Medicaid expansion in postpartum women. And so then my objective statement would be to understand how Medicaid expansion improved outcomes for postpartum women. That's very clear. It's one sentence. It's who are we focusing on? What are we focusing on? And it needs to be limited to just one sentence because we can get really broad, but when you drill down to it, your one study is focused on one question at a time. And then the next thing you're going to move into is what are your data sources? So, I think there's always this duality between what is available and what is ideal. So sometimes I like to think, okay, if I had all the things I wanted in the world, including my perfect data set, what would it look like? And then I back up and say, okay, what is it actually available to me? And when you're thinking about those questions, you need to think about what are the strengths and weaknesses of your data source. So, and then also what are the alternatives? So you might choose one data source, but as a backup, you might choose another. Or if this data source doesn't have this particular question the way I want, then I would use this. And I just put some good data sources. These are all publicly available. So 500 cities is a place-specific data. So they have Richmond on there. It's the 500 biggest cities in the US. And they have data at the census tract level. So information about like poverty level at census tract, employment, I think like how many people own a car. So a bunch of different, and health outcomes. So I think they have like asthma, heart disease, a bunch of different outcomes by census tract. So that's a publicly available data source. Obviously you have the census data for population level. More specific to pregnancy and postpartum, there's PRAMS, which is publicly available. That's by state. And that's run by the CDC, but they have state-specific information. So that's another good data source. Those are also, the PRAMS is good if you're thinking, okay, I want to develop a survey, but I don't know how to phrase a question. You can always look at PRAMS and say, oh, people have done this before. This is the way they asked it. This is the way they had the answer choices. So that's a good resource as well. And just some common data sources for the types of research that we generally do. So like I said, if you want to develop a survey, that's a really great data resource. You obviously, if you're developing your own survey, you get a lot more agency about what you're focusing on, how you're asking the questions, what questions you're asking. And you can also ask more qualitative questions. So for example, how would you rate your own health? Instead of just looking at like, what is someone's blood pressure? So it's a little bit more subjective measures that you can ask. But the big con to survey data is it can be really expensive and take a lot of time. And then you also have to deal with survey non-response. So a good survey response is about 20%, which obviously is not a lot of people responding to surveys. And you have to think about, okay, who are the types of people not responding to your survey? So the worst outcome would be a particular type of person isn't responding, because then you're systematically missing a group of people. So that's one of the big concerns about surveys. There are ways to deal with that, like you can add weights for things, you can kind of do things on the back end statistically to account for that, but that's one of the major downsides. One thing we do a lot in this lab is chart abstraction. So going into people's EMR and drawing out the information you think is most pertinent to whatever study you're doing. Obviously, it's really detailed data, which is incredible. You also have less of a non-response bias because people don't have to do anything to participate except consent, depending on the study. And then, but the con is, if you're within one one academic center or whatever health center, you're gonna generally miss any health encounter data that was done at a different institution. So for example, this is often a problem with psychiatric care. So if someone sees a therapist in a private practice, that's not gonna be in their VCU chart. So that you need to be aware that what data will be missing. And if you're focused on therapy, then maybe a chart abstraction isn't the best choice for you. Maybe survey data is. Another thing I often use is health claims data. So if you can look, there's a data source that VCU has access to called all payer claims data. And that is what it sounds like. So for all the different types of payers, Medicare, Medicaid, private insurers, they essentially report everyone's encounter data. And then you can look at that data. However, it is de-identified, and you can't see like very specific information about the encounter. So you don't necessarily get like the diagnosis or why someone was referred, and you definitely don't get the doctor notes. So it's missing some of that key information. But it is a good source depending on the question you want. So for example, if you want to know if someone got their blood pressure checked, you could use, well, that probably wouldn't be in the claims data. If you want to know if they went to their primary care doctor, that would be in the claims data. But if you want to know what their blood pressure was, that would be in their chart. So just thinking through what kind of data would be most appropriate for your question. And then I'm a big fan of publicly available data. I mentioned a few options in the previous slide, and that's population level. It's generally free, depending, it's readily accessible. But like I said, you can't determine the questions, and you generally can't determine the specific population you want. So for example, you're not going to be able to say, okay, I want women in Richmond, Virginia. So that is one of the limitations. Two other things to think about with your data sources. What is the structure of the data? So are you looking at one person over time? So is it longitudinal data? Or is it a group of people at one time? Is it cross-sectional? And that just changes what kind of questions you can ask and what kind of statistics you can do. So those are two things to think about. And then also, are the observations within your data independent? So for example, if you're looking at the same person over time, those are not independent observations. If you're looking at a clinic and you have 5 different providers and you're looking at their patients across those 5 providers, those patients are not independent because they're clustered within providers. So people within one specific provider is independent, but across providers, they're dependent. So when you're thinking about the data choices and the statistics you can do, it's really important to consider whether or not you're looking at an independent or dependent observations, because that impacts the statistics behind your conclusions. The next thing you want to think about is your sample. So when you're thinking, once you choose your data set, do you want everyone in the data set? Do you want just some people? And why do you want just some people? So for example, and that's another duality thing. So you want to balance and make sure that the sample is similar enough to each other that you can draw a valid conclusion, but you also want it to be generalizable enough to a different population that the conclusion is relevant to another group of people. And when you're weighing those two things, you want to make sure that your internal validity, that the sample is similar enough within itself, that's more important, but you also want to think about how it relates to a population outside of just the specific sample. So for example, you might want to limit it just to inpatient people who start opioid use disorder treatment inpatient rather than people who start at both inpatient and outpatient, if you think those two groups are distinctly different for a specific reason. So then you might just want to limit it to people who start opioid use disorder treatment inpatient. But that would limit your ability to take that conclusion and place it onto a group that is starting treatment in an outpatient facility. It would also limit your ability, for example, if we're looking at people starting treatment inpatient at VCU, which is an academic medical center that's a public safety net, you're probably not going to want to apply that same conclusion to a private inpatient treatment facility because those samples are just not similar enough. So that's always something to think about. How similar is your sample within itself and how is it similar across a different population? But internal validity always wins. That's important to remember. And then the next part is thinking about your variables. So you have your outcome and you have your variable of interest, and then you want to draw that relationship out, and then you have all the other things that can impact both your variable of interest and your outcome. And there's 3 major groups of types of things that can impact that relationship. One is a moderator, which we think of, okay, you can think of that as race. So for example, if you're looking at opioid use disorder treatment and overall health after like 1 year of treatment, someone's race may impact that effect size across all the other covariates. So that is going to affect the magnitude of the relationship between your treatment variable and your outcome. So you're going to treat it as a moderator. And then your mediator is things that will go within that relationship. So think about it. What might be driving the relationship between the outcome you're interested in and the treatment. And then the one that I think everyone's most scared of is confounders. And that's something that impacts just both the treatment and the outcome. And that's something that we control for in the analysis. And this is something that your statistician or someone else on your team, if you're not like super familiar with these terms, they can help you think through. But it's just important to think through at the very beginning of your study. So you're measuring things accurately and you're also able to think about your analysis in the best way possible. And then some features of variables to think about. So there's kind of 2, you can think about it going down this tree. You have numerical data and categorical. And your numerical is either continuous, so things like age, weight, blood pressure, or discrete. So those are integer values. And then categorical, you have either ordinal data, which is has a hierarchy, and you can think of like a Likert scale. You really agree with something, you disagree. That's that has a relationship, a hierarchy, versus nominal. that could be your favorite color, and that there's no difference between like red and green as far as your order variables. So things to think about as far as your variables. This is your different types of study designs. Next thing to think about, these are common in epidemiology and the work that we do here. The technical terms are less important, but just think about the point of time you're at now, and then whether or not you're recalling data or looking into the future. So if you get someone at one time and then you're waiting for them to develop a disease or tracking their outcomes over time, that's prospective, versus, okay, you have someone who you know has X disease, and then you ask, okay, did you have this experience prior? That will be retrospective. So things to think about. So once you know what your variables are, who you're looking at, what data you're going to use, and the other thing to say about your variables is that they should be very specific. So they need to be very clear. For example, if you're looking at opioid use disorder treatment, are you talking about methadone and buprenorphine? Are you talking about therapy? Are you talking about it over time for a year? Are you talking about it in 30 days? Are you talking about just going to the provider? So make it as specific as possible so that it is clearly measurable and there's no one is confused about what terms mean. So then once you do all that, you can form your hypothesis. And so you have your null hypothesis, which is generally there is no relationship. And then you have your alternative hypothesis, which is the relationship you're proposing between your treatment and your outcome. And you need to have a direction to it. So, and it needs to be a statement. So I think that we'll use this one that I have on my screen, that the weight between smokers and non-smokers different. And in fact, I believe that the weight of smokers is lower than the weight of non-smokers. And so you can see that there's direction to it, and it is a statement. It's not a question, it's a statement. And when we think about statistical testing, that p-value is whether or not if you, so if it's less than 0.05 or whatever you decide as the value, then you're going to reject your null hypothesis. You're going to say that there actually is a relationship generally. So when you're thinking about your hypothesis, it's important to think about it in that way. And then the next part is your statistical analysis plan. And it's always helpful, no matter where you are in your training, to talk to a statistician because they're experts and most of us are not. And that's okay because we have different skill sets. But simple things are thinking about how your data is structured. Is it repeated individuals over time? Is it different groups of people over time? Is it one group of people at once? And presenting all of this to your statistician is super helpful. So being really clear before you get to them about your variables, your data sources, all that can be really helpful in them guiding you. And I love biostatisticians because they're really helpful and always think of things that you didn't. So they're a great person to consult. And then prior to even touching the data, you should create some results and figures. So table shells are your best friend because, like I said, the more specific you can get, the better. And generally, I think of general terms. And then when you go to actually make your table shell, you're like, oh my God, I have no idea what I was talking about. So having your table shell is very important because it, you know, you have to spell out, okay, is this variable continuous? Is it, am I going to break it into groups? How many groups am I going to have? Does this look ridiculous? Like too many things to think about. So that's really helpful. And your figure one should describe your populations. That's generally your demographics and then broken down by your outcome. And then your figure two should generally provide the results from your whatever statistical test you choose. And then your figure three tends to be either like sensitivity testing, you tried slightly different variations of the test, and these are your results, or it could be looking at a specific subsample of your sample. So that one you can kind of play around with. And then your figure 4 or any additional figures is generally some kind of visual to it, or how you selected your sample. So that's what I think about as far as my figures. So that, the last thing is consider forms of bias. So I was talking about earlier, internal validity versus external validity. Internal validity is essentially like, how good is your study? Can we believe it? Why wouldn't we believe it? And then your external validity is, okay, can I bring this conclusion for this specific people to another group of people? And it's important to think about these things before you start going, because you can either address them ahead of time. For example, if you're concerned about your sample selection, maybe you could try getting another academic medical center involved. Or if you're worried about a particular missing data, then maybe a survey really isn't the best option for you. So thinking about that is really important prior to getting going. And that's another way statisticians can be super helpful, because they are generally up in arms about validity, which is a good thing, so they can help you out. And this is my last slide. Write out the whole plan before you touch the data, or before anyone touches the data, and write it out, not just in your head. Write it out, talk to someone else about it, and you should share it with anyone who's going to be involved in your team, because they will either be really excited, which is great, or be excited and have a comment or question, and it makes it better. So write it out, share it with other people, and always, I think about your research as a story. Obviously, when I started talking about the clinical experience, generally when you're working in a clinic and you get your idea from that experience, you have a hunch about something. So you think, okay, this might be happening. And so obviously your data might not align with that, and that's okay. But when you're thinking about your analysis plan, think about, what story do I want to tell? Whose story do I want to tell? And go from there. And then also, like I said, this is a generally very long process, at least a year, and I have a terrible memory. So keep your plan updated, because you'll think, oh, I made that decision. Why the heck did I make that decision? So documenting it can be really helpful. Also, if you have to leave, if you graduate, pass it on to someone else, that's very helpful. Other thing is this human subjects research. If it's human subjects research, you need to do IRB. And you need to do IRB before you start. So I put the link, this is the NIH decision aid for deciding if it's human subjects. And I think it's tricky in our work, because a lot of times we're right on the edge. HPI, so protected health information, generally is considered human subjects research. So even though we're not collecting specimens or working with mice or rats or whatever, you need to be thinking about this, because we generally have health data, and that is considered research. And then we've talked about this before in lab meetings, but think about authorship from the very beginning. So that's obviously something that you should discuss as a team and with Dr. Martin. But I think that's also where making the whole plan beforehand gives you ownership of the project and allows people to kind of see what's happening and then decide how much to contribute ahead of time, which helps the authorship process. So that's all I have today. I will give Bhushan my Excel for the lit review, and then I have 2 different Word documents that I use to make my research plans when I start on a new project. But if you have questions, I don't know all the answers, but I've done it a few times and other people have done it as well. So that's all I got.
Thank you, Hannah. That was great. I feel like there were like 1,000 pearls in your presentation. There were so many things where I was like, yep, that's true. Yep, been through there. I have a lot of things I can emphasize, but I'm going to let people ask questions, whatever questions they have first. Well, one thing I'll emphasize, and thank you for sharing your templates with Bhushan. I think that would be great to have different options. But anyone who's worked with me on designing their like analysis, knows that I always am a big proponent of making your tables first before touching the data. So I will highly emphasize that point that you made. And it is very common that once you start making the tables, just like what you said, you'll be like, oh, I actually don't know exactly what I'm doing. And let me go back to the drawing board a little bit or get some more advice, which is a good thing to do before you even touch the data. So I love how you emphasize that, because I think I'm a big proponent of that too. And then a question I had, Hannah, was when I was kind of first starting out, writing in research, I did a lot of analyses of publicly available data, just like what you mentioned. I did stuff with TEDS and NISDA, et cetera. And it was great. It was a great way to get started, I thought, and just like what you mentioned. But what I struggled with, what I remember struggling with at those beginning stages in the first few years was like, where do you find out about these data sets? And I know you gave examples of some, but I feel like that's how I found out about these things, is someone just randomly told me about PRAMs, for example, or someone told me about the different data sets I've worked with. And so do you know of any tips or tricks when people are maybe starting to try to work with one of those data sets, like how you find out where they are, what they are, and more information?
Yeah, I think that's tricky. iPums is one. I can put the link in the chat, that has a couple different health surveys on one website, which is helpful. And they also have a pretty good tool, so you don't have to do as much analysis by yourself. Yeah, I think I ran into the same problem. I think reading papers is probably the most helpful, because then, those are the subject area experts and whatever you want to look at. And so if they're using a publicly available data set in particular, then I just go look at that. And if they're not, then I assume that there's a reason why not, because maybe it's not appropriate for the type of research you want to do. Yeah, or I mean, you can always Google. CDC is in charge of a lot of them, so you can Google the topic and then CDC. Yeah, I think it's just built up over time. I don't know of a central place.
And then I'm just going to highlight too, especially for anyone who's going to be working on analyses in the future, that this presentation from Hannah was very helpful too, when you are going to be building those tables and building that study outline, because you went through a lot of details, Hannah, on what you're thinking about your variables and thinking about your outcomes, especially, and your independent and dependent variables. Like, is it continuous? Is it categorical? Is it at the individual level? Is it at the group level? Is it clustered? Is it not clustered? Is it independent? Are they not independent? You brought up like a million pearls about those, and so I'll just emphasize that anyone who's going to be working on study plans in the future, we'll have this talk on the YouTube channel, and it'll be very helpful thinking through all of those different aspects, because you did highlight how in your study plan, naming your outcome and your exposure variables are the two most important ones, right, in your data set. Mm-hmm. So is there anything that you would add on? Because that's a lot of things you went over to think about when you're trying to identify your independent, dependent variables. Do you have like a certain flow or recommendation of kind of like the order of things to think of when you're trying to kind of nail down exactly how am I going to answer my research question with these two variables of interest?
Yeah, I mean, I sound like a broken record, but I usually go back to what's done before. So, I don't ideally want to be defining any variable because I don't know the most, and a lot of things are validated measures. And so I don't ideally want to be creating any measure. So I go and look, okay, what was someone else's outcome, and do I have the data to recreate that? And obviously, you don't want to just carbon copy other people's work, but you can, modify it maybe in a different population or at a different time point, all those things. But I think my goal is generally find one that makes sense to me. Okay, I have the data, move from there. So that's how I usually do it.
That's actually great advice. Because usually my first question is going to be like, what has someone else done? Or show me a paper, an example.
Yeah. I don't want my innovation in creating variables because that's just too complicated.
Awesome. Well, any other questions that people have? Awesome. Thank you so much, Hannah. That was great.